So it is my honour to introduce Myles Chadwick, who is passionate about serving people and animals and has been his entire adult life. Since 2012, he's had the honour of doing so with Emancipet. They offer free and low-cost veterinary care throughout Texas and in Pennsylvania. Emancipet's commitment to creating social change, its high standard of care, and its innovative programming drove his decision to join this amazing team of animal advocates. As Vice President of Emancipet New School, he oversees and delivers leadership and program development training to animal welfare professionals interested in increasing their own impact and creating social change within their communities. Prior to working with Emancipet, Myles was with the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, working with the National Spay-Neuter Project and the Berg Memorial Animal Hospital. Thank you, Myles.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fawcett. That was a great presentation. I thought it was fascinating. The reasons that people have chosen not to desex their pets are almost identical to the ones in the United States that have been surveyed. The top 4 reasons that people have not done it is because they don't have time, they don't believe that they need to because their pet is confined, they think it's too expensive, or they don't know the right age. So it's all very similar. Good morning, everybody. It's very exciting to be here in Australia. This is my first time in Australia, and I'm finally kind of overcoming my jet lag today. So hopefully we'll be able to get through this without too much pain. So before I get started with my talk today, I wanted to kind of survey the room a little bit. How many people in the room are working in organizations that are exclusively serving owned animals? Animals that are in homes that are owned? Yeah, just a couple of hands. Okay. And then how many of you are working in organizations that are exclusively serving homeless animals? Okay, quite a few more. And then how many of you are working in organizations that are somewhere between those two things? Okay, that's great. So the reason I ask this is because in the United States right now, and for the last, I'd say 6 or 7 years, of at least that I've seen, there's started to be this really big movement towards working with animals in homes. And it's not moving away from working with animals that are in shelters and that are homeless, but it is a widening of the lens, so to speak, a stepping back and looking at the big picture. There's a lot more focus on keeping pets in homes, a lot more programs and brainstorming and innovation around avoiding animals ever even ending up in the shelter. And the organization that I work with, we're all the way over here on this end of just working with animals that are in homes. So our mission is to make veterinary care affordable and accessible to everyone. And so we actually intentionally really don't work with animals that are in shelters or in foster, because our focus is to provide services to people that have their own animals. And as I talk today, about my experience and how I ended up where I am and why I believe so strongly in the work that we do. The journey that I've had is very, very much from trying to protect animals from people to trying to help animals stay with people. So I work at Emancipet. We have clinics throughout Texas. We recently opened in Pennsylvania, and we're continuing to grow. We're looking at opening clinics in other states as well. We're serving over 100,000 animals a year currently. When I started at Emancipet only 5 years ago, I think we were serving closer to 40,000. So we've really had some dramatic growth. We offer free spay and neuter services and low-cost spay and neuter services, low-cost wellness services, and we're starting to grow those services as well. I started out in a very different place. So let me tell you a little bit more about how I grew up. I had sort of a non-traditional upbringing. I was born in Denver, Colorado, in the United States, to a single mom who is a cook. She's a chef now. She's been cooking her whole life. She still works as 60 hours a week as a chef. She has no retirement plan. Don't be a chef. So she raised me on a prep cook salary, single mom, and up until I was about 5 years old, we lived in pretty poor neighborhood. I didn't have a lot of things that I wanted, but we were happy. And she met my stepdad when I was 5, and he was a chemistry professor, also not a big money-making career, but he did have opportunities to travel. And so we started moving around as he did postdoctoral work and research all around the United States and around the world. So we moved to Wisconsin for a little while. We lived in Madison. And then we moved to Haifa, Israel. And growing up, my grandparents always had dogs and cats. And so I always loved dogs and cats. And I remember when I first moved to Israel, I was thrilled because there were cats everywhere. Like they didn't have any kind of pound or shelter for cats. They just kind of let them be. So they were almost like squirrels or rats or something. People thought of them that way. People didn't think of them the way that I thought of cats, which as an 8-year-old moving to this country, I was like overjoyed because there were cats everywhere. And I also, when I moved there, we didn't have the resources for me to go to a private school. So my parents enrolled me in public school. And they didn't have a program for learning Hebrew as a second language. So I was in class, in Hebrew-speaking class, and I just had to learn Hebrew. And I did. But it was hard. And those first few months, I immediately found a cat that lived around my building that I became really attached to and started letting into my house and treating like a pet. And my friends thought that was fascinating. It was kind of like your friend that has a pet rat or a pet mouse. Like people would come over and they'd be like, oh, can I touch it? Oh, it's so weird. And they thought I was just like some, kind of animal whisperer because I could harness a cat. But the cat was important to me. I mean, I remember being, as I moved around and lived in different houses in Israel and explored, that was kind of my home. There was a piece of that felt very much like being back in the United States and knowing that it didn't matter what language I spoke, right? Because the cat didn't understand. While we were living there, I was lucky enough to get to go to some of the surrounding countries, and I went to Egypt several times. And there's this weird thing between Israel and Egypt, and I mean, we all are aware of this sort of situation in the Middle East, but they just are almost intentionally as opposite from each other as possible. So like everyone in Israel drove Subarus, and everyone in Egypt drove Hondas. Like it was just like, and you would never see a Subaru in Egypt, you'd never see a Honda in Israel. And everybody in Israel drank Coca-Cola, and they did not have Pepsi, but they only had Pepsi in Egypt. And just in keeping with that, I did not see cats anywhere when I went to Egypt, but there were dogs everywhere, stray dogs. And I remember going to, different, the kind of sites that you would visit as a tourist in another country. So, going to the pyramids, and I remember specifically the Step Pyramid, which is the oldest pyramid in Egypt. And there were just dogs laying in the shadows everywhere, and they were so skinny that they looked like they were dead. But my grandma was with me, and she had like a cracker in her purse, and all of these dead dogs like sprung to life and surrounded us. And they were very sweet. They weren't aggressive, but they were just literally like reserving energy, waiting for a tourist that would give them food. And so I moved on. We ended up moving to Tokyo after that. And living in Tokyo, it was this completely other experience, right? So in Israel, I could speak the language after a year or two. I helped my parents buy their car and rent their house. They didn't learn to speak the language as well as I did. I was a little fair-skinned ginger kid, but I could kind of pass, especially over the phone. In Japan, that was not the case. When I would walk down the street, little Japanese kids would jump up and down and scream and point and yell gaijin at me, which is barbarian foreigner. And I got very used to that, like being, like standing out. And learning Japanese was much harder. I ended up going to a Catholic school there that was English speaking. And one of the things that was really hard for me in Israel in Japan, it was that there weren't animals everywhere in the same way. The people that I knew that owned animals were generally more affluent. People live in Tokyo anyway, they live in apartments, and people don't have yards. So very few people had dogs, few people had cats, and the few that I knew that did, I would try to hang out with them whenever I could so that I could spend time around their animals. So then I lived in Tokyo for a couple of years. I moved back to the United States. I lived in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania for a while, and then I moved to Flagstaff, Arizona for high school, which is when you think of, like, somebody had asked me yesterday, because I live in Texas now, somebody asked me if everybody wore cowboy hats there. No, some do, but in Arizona, yes, they do. In Arizona, it's straight up like the way you would picture a bunch of sort of American rednecks. They all have giant 10-gallon hats. At my high school, there was the cowboy parking lot, which was where all the cowboys hung out, and they wore like super tight jeans and giant cowboy hats, gun racks in all of their cars. That was very much, and like huge belt buckles, like the size of my head. So that was a big culture shock, right? From moving to all these different countries and then moving to like this version of America. And the thing that's interesting about, one of the things that's interesting about Arizona is that it's more than 2/3 of Arizona is Native American reservation. And so they don't have daylight savings there, and the reason is because the reservations don't. And I don't know how much you guys know about Native American reservations, but we didn't really give them the best parts of the country. We kind of screwed them a little bit, kind of famously. So these are areas that are under-resourced. These are areas that don't have a lot of water or access to the infrastructure that the rest of America has. And so on those reservations, dogs are running free. You know, there's just packs of dogs. In more recent years, there's been a movement to sort of bring spay-neuter to these tribal lands and try to help curb the animal overpopulation. But there's really a larger sort of systemic issue going on there. And for me, coming from Japan, where, you know, only very wealthy people had animals and you hardly saw them at all, to now living in an area where you could drive outside of town and be on the reservation and see packs of emaciated dogs running alongside the road, and also herds of emaciated horses running alongside the road, was quite the culture shock. The reason that I'm telling you all of this background is I want you to understand the lens through which I saw the world when I came into animal welfare, and which is to say that I was fairly flexible. I believed that people loved pets when they were considered pets. But for instance, in Israel, if the cats weren't considered pets, like they were more of a mystery and more of just something that you wouldn't even notice because it's just they're out there all the time. I didn't think that people like hated cats there. They just didn't hold them in the same regard. Just like when I went to Arizona and I saw packs of dogs, people liked the dogs. They felt possession, the tribes felt possession of the dogs. Many of my friends going to high school were Native American, and we talked about this. Like it wasn't that they didn't care about them, but they didn't care for them in the same way, and they didn't individually own individual dogs. As a tribe, they felt pride and ownership over those dogs. And so it was just a different way of loving and caring about animals. And so when I first joined the animal welfare movement, I ended up following in my mother's footsteps and being a chef for 15 years. But eventually, I moved to New York City to open a restaurant. And when I got there, I needed paying work until the restaurant got open. So we were working on our business plan. We were building out a space. And I just needed something that could help me pay the bills until the restaurant got open. And I saw this advertisement online for kennel technicians at the ASPCA. And I thought, how cool would it be to work at the ASPCA and just like pet dogs all day? Like I could totally do that. Even if it's minimum wage, I could do that for a couple months until the restaurant's open. And so I went in and I applied, and I got called for an interview, and I was super excited. And the ASPCA, I mean, it's the oldest, biggest companion animal welfare organization in the United States. It's been around since the 1800s. It's well known. So even though I was new to New York at the time, I had heard of the ASPCA. And so I got called in for the interview, and they brought me in, and they were like, well, we're looking at your resume, and it seems like you're overqualified for a kennel technician position. You've been managing restaurants for 10 years. Would you be interested in managing the hospital? We have a position open. And you'd be managing especially the customer service team and that experience, and restaurants are customer service, and I'm like, not where I work, but okay. I wasn't a waiter. I worked in the back of the house. But yeah, so I said, sure, I will take that job that pays more money. That sounds great. So I took this job, and so coming into this, I had this very flexible view of like how people interact with animals, how people live their lives. I had lived in very poor situations. I had lived in sort of more privileged situations, and I really was mostly just excited about helping animals. There was no part of me that was like thinking that I'm going to change the world for animals living in poverty, or even thinking about really the people that I would be serving. It was more just like, I'm going to get to see dogs and cats every single day, and that cannot be a bad thing. So I started, I remember my very first day on the job, people started explaining to me what my job was. And and I want to say right now, I'm going to tell some stories about this hospital that I worked at that are not particularly flattering. They've changed a lot since then, and I've had conversations with the CEO of the ASPCA about the fact that I talk about these stories in my presentations, and he's like, it's fine, I understand, it's true, you need to tell the true story. So I'm not disparaging the ASPCA, they're great people and I have a lot of friends there. But some of these stories are a little rough. So I just remember my first day, people explaining to me that we were the only place in New York City, a city of 9 million people, where you could potentially get free service or some kind of funding to help with your animal's issues. And that's kind of crazy, right? Like one hospital for a city of 9 million people, and anybody that comes in may or may not need assistance. And that part of my job was to help people and figure out if we could help them financially. And that what that actually meant was having them provide 3 different forms of proof of government assistance, which already made me pretty uncomfortable. And then on top of that, they had to apply for a credit card that if they were approved, they could use to pay for services. And if they were not approved, depending on their situation, which was kind of at the discretion of the customer service team, they could have 1 or 2 or even 3 other people that they would have to find to apply on their behalf. And if any of those people were approved, those people would then have to spend the money on that credit card that they had just been approved for to pay for the care. This is not uncommon in the animal welfare movement in the United States, unfortunately. So the reason that I was explained to me that this was the case was because many, many people had the means to pay, but were going to pretend that they didn't and try and cheat the system. And I was told that a lot of people were bringing in their animal for issues that were totally preventable if they had just been more responsible as pet owners. So we'd have blocked cats come in every day, and if they had just been feeding their cats better food or wet food, then they wouldn't have gotten blocked in the first place. We had high-rise syndrome animals coming in, which means they fell out of a window. And if those owners had only kept their windows closed, then they wouldn't be there with their animal in emergency. We had animals come in that were hit by car, if they'd only been on a leash, and animals coming in with more serious prognosis like cancer. And if they'd only spayed and neutered their pet, then they wouldn't be in that situation. One of the other hoops that they had to jump through in order to get help from us was that they had to agree to spay or neuter their animal before we would help them. So it didn't matter whether or not they had any familiarity with the process. It didn't matter whether or not they were upset. It didn't matter if their animal was, basically barely stable in back. They still had to sign this document saying that we could spay or neuter their animal before we would agree to help them. And there was this underlying theme of the stories that I was being told about pet owners in America, which was that they suck. This was what the through line of all of these stories that I was being told by my coworkers were, that pet owners are basically irresponsible, and that most of the people that come to us are kind of jerks. And that our job was to protect people, to protect animals from the bad people who had them. So I was really torn about this, right? Part of me is like, well, I can't imagine that all of these people working at this highly, well-known organization would be wrong. I can't imagine that I'm the only person that sees the problem with this, so I must be wrong. So I moved forward with doing this job. I would go through every day, I would have to make a dozen or more funding decisions about people, and like every time I got to help somebody and their pet, it was such a good feeling. And every time I couldn't, it was such a horrible feeling. I had smoked for years and years and years when I was working in restaurants, and I quit about 3 years before this. I started smoking again during this time. I would go home at night and I would sit in the window of my tiny, crappy apartment and I would chain smoke because I was so stressed out about having to tell people that I couldn't help their pet. I remember a few of these stories really specifically, a few of the stories that really kind of started to shake the foundation of what I was being told and what I was willing to believe about people and their pets. The first one was this big Mastiff Pit Bull mix named Killa. So we were open till about 7 p.m. and Killa came in one night with his owner at about 6:30, and he had been walking him, and they had been walking between two cars that were parallel parked on the street, and the car in front had backed up and pinned Killa between the bumpers and broken his scapula. So by the time he got to the hospital, the owner was pretty upset. You could see the sort of bone jutting out in the skin. This dog, of course, was completely just like smiling and like relaxed. It was pretty insane. I was just like, I don't understand. And he was just wanted to lick everybody. And so immediately we get him, take him back, we triage, make sure he's stable. We bring him back out while I'm, and there's a lot of, everybody had already assumed because it was, somebody coming in with a giant pit bull with an injury that the guy wasn't gonna have money. So they brought him back out without even asking if the guy had put down a deposit or had money or anything. They brought him back out, and he's sitting in the waiting room, and I'm going through all this stuff, and I'm like, so do you have any money that you can put toward this today? He says, no. I say, okay, I need you to do this care credit thing, apply for this credit card. He does that. He shows me all his proof of income. I'm like, awesome. I think the good news is it's a clean break. I think we can help you. We can put you on a payment plan, so you don't have to pay anything today. We'll come up with an amount that you feel like you can afford. He's like, great, no problem. I just want him to be okay. And I was like, cool, and I just need you to sign this document that says that we can neuter him while we have him in back. And he was like, what is that? And I explained, we believe strongly as part of our mission at the organization that animal overpopulation in our country is the result of too many animals breeding and accidental litters, and so we want to neuter him so that he can't have puppies. And he just was devastated, and he looked at me and he said, why would I want to do that? And I didn't have a great answer. I mean, the only answer I could come up with was because you want us to fix his shoulder. But that didn't feel like a really strong answer. It kind of felt like a horrible, horrible thing to say. We went back and forth. He wouldn't budge. He was so upset about his dog being in pain, but he also was not willing to let us alter his dog simply because we told him that that was what we needed to do in order to help him. Finally, so now it's 8 o'clock. We've been closed for an hour. It's just me and him. We're going back and forth. I'm the only manager on duty in the whole building. I end up having to call the vice president of the hospital at home, who's like 4 levels above me, and call him at home on a Saturday night to say, like, this is the situation. This guy will not sign a spay-neuter form. The dog is here, the dog is stable, the dog is fine, but he needs surgery, and I don't know what else to do. And he said, well, is he willing to relinquish him? And I said, I think he might be. So I went out and I talked to him, and he said that he was. And we ended up bending the rules, because the rules were that we didn't really take in pit bulls, pit bull type dogs, because those are the dogs that are most abundant in our shelters. And so we were a limited intake shelter, the shelter that was attached to our hospital, and we pulled from the city shelter. And at that time, we weren't pulling a lot of pit bulls because they were the hardest to adopt. And in general, we weren't going to take some mystery pit bull off the street with a shattered shoulder who we couldn't even behavior test. So the VP made the call that I could go ahead and make this exception and get Killa into the adoption program so that he could have his surgery. And the guy had to sign a form saying that he understood that he relinquished all of his rights to the dog, that he didn't get to find out what happened to him, that he didn't get to know anything about him. And we did it. We moved forward. We took the dog in. And I knew that he was going to have surgery, and I felt really good about that. But I really wasn't comfortable with what I had done and with the role that I had had in separating this dog that clearly loved his owner from this owner that clearly loved this dog. And the worst part is that that dog ended up being euthanized a couple of weeks later once he failed behavior. And I had no recourse. And it was upsetting to me that we had all these rules in place that allowed for us to bend the rules for intaking the animal, but not for just letting the dog have shoulder surgery without being neutered, but not for like pushing that conversation down the road to maybe when the owner wasn't hysterically upset. So time goes on. I'm still working in the hospital, and I have to apologize. I have a cold, so when I sniffle, I'm trying to do it away from the microphone. Time goes on. I have this guy come in one day. As soon as he gets off the elevator, you start seeing people behind the desk roll their eyes. He's got giant baggy jeans. He's African American. He's got cornrows. He's got this huge jacket, hoodie, little brindle pit bull puppy. Comes in, he says, I don't know, he's just not doing right. Dog immediately poops and vomits, and we're like, let's get him in a room. He's got parvo. So everyone around me is talking trash about this guy before we've even gotten back into the room and had a vet see the puppy, because he's got a pit bull puppy, because he's African American, because he's dressed the way he's dressed. And that obviously he's breeding or fighting pit bulls. Like that is the conclusion that every human being on that floor of the building has come to already. We put together the cost for keeping the animal in the hospital overnight, and they pad the estimate because they want to get as much money from the guy up front as they can, because they figure he's not going to be able to pay. You have to put 50% down, so they give him an estimate for $2,000 to keep the animal for at least one night. And he pulls $1,000 out of his pocket, and small bills. He puts it together, and he puts down the money. And I'm really elated because I didn't have to have him sign a spay-neuter form, because I've been, now that I told you that one story, I've had that experience 100 times now of people crying about having to be forced to sign this form. So I'm like, oh my God, thank God you have money. We get the dog in. I'm worried about what's going to happen the next day, because we know he's not going to be over parvo the next day, so there's going to be another estimate. There's going to be more money. The next day he comes back in, and see him get off the elevator, and he's got a box. He's got 4 more puppies with parvo in it. So we get him in. We put together another estimate. I go back and I ride the doctors about it, and I'm like, look, make it as low as possible. Do not pad the estimate. Like, we need to get these dogs in. I can work with them on financing. So we get all the animals in. We put together an estimate. The new estimate for all 5 animals, all 5 puppies, is about $6,000 for a few days' care. He comes up with another $2,000. And he comes back the next day to see the puppies. He waits for over an hour because I wasn't there, and the people behind the desk hate this guy because he's clearly breeding and fighting pit bulls. This is not based in any kind of anything that's happened. This is just what everyone's decided. And we have an updated estimate, and he tells me, look, I don't have any more money. I've given you guys however much it was, $3,000, $4,000. And I'm just thinking, well, I have no idea what I would do if I was in a situation, because I definitely don't have that kind of money. So I ended up having him sign the spay-neuter agreement. He signs it. He ends up paying off his payment plan over the course of the time that I worked there. He comes every single day to visit those puppies. All of the puppies lived, and every single person on my staff treated him like crap every time he came in. They made him wait an extra hour before they let him go back to see his puppies every day, because he was clearly breeding animals. He was clearly an irresponsible pet owner. So these stories these are two stories of hundreds of things that had happened to me during that time, happened to the people that we were serving that really broke my heart. I was gonna quit after a year, even though I was getting all of this, I was getting so much from the job, from working with animals, but at the same time, it was tearing me apart. And I got this opportunity to go work in the spay-neuter program, which was like kind of the golden child. It was like the cutting edge of everything, right? It was, we're gonna reduce animal overpopulation. It's a totally different thing. If we do this, we won't be, my thinking was that I wouldn't have to judge people so harshly. One of the things I got to do in that program was launch MASH clinics. Are you guys familiar with MASH clinics? Do you have those here? So yeah, or essentially we would set up a clinic in a borrowed space for a day. We were doing a MASH clinic on Staten Island, which is the borough of Manhattan that you will never visit if you go to New York. It's an island. You can only get there from a bridge. There's one bridge that goes there from Brooklyn, and there's a ferry that goes there from South Manhattan. It's not like the rest of New York in that it's not as densely populated. People have houses with yards. It's very Italian. And there are parts of it that are very poor. We were doing a MASH clinic in the basement of a church on Staten Island when I saw that there was a house across the street that had 6 dogs, all of different breeds and ages, running around in the yard. And I went over and I talked to the woman on the front porch who was about 30. And I asked her if she was interested in getting her animals spayed and neutered, and told her I could do it for $5 a piece, because that was our deal in that department. We could do it for $5 a piece if you proved that you were low income. And she said, I don't have, $30 to do that. And I said, okay, well, here's what we can offer. I see that they have fleas. We can get them for collars and microchips and all these things, and it'll all be only like $5, but we'll be back next month. And I lived nearby at the time. I actually was living on Staten Island, so I kind of kept an eye on the house, and I realized that she had a bunch of kids, the oldest of which was 16. Again, she was about 30. And she had maybe 5 kids. We went back then a month later, and I went to her and I said, look, I can do it for free. Would you let me do it if we do it for free? Which I was not supposed to do. And she said, sure, we can do 3 of them. You can do the puppies. So we took the 3 youngest dogs. Each one of her youngest kids came out holding a dog and carried them over to the clinic. We got them all spayed and neutered. We gave them Capstar to get rid of all the fleas and ticks and all that stuff. Got them collars, shaved out the mats, brought them home. And when I brought them home, all of her youngest kids weren't home. We had, and her oldest son was there, who was 16. And they brought out one crate that they had that they were gonna recover all of them in. And so we put them all into this crate, and I offered to help bring them into the house. And he said, after some hesitation, he said, sure. And we went into the house, and I saw the way that they were living. They only had one mattress between the whole family. In some of the bedrooms, they just had piles of clothes and foam mats that they were sleeping on. And I saw that the dogs were living in those same conditions with them, and that we're getting this sort of to sleep on those beds with them, and that they were treating them in a way that, they treated them as well as they treated themselves. They were doing their best to take care of these pets. And it broke my heart, but it also was a breakthrough moment for me in realizing that just because people aren't doing all the things that I wish that they were doing. So I wish that they had not let 2 of those dogs have 3 puppies. I wish that those dogs didn't have mats and fleas when they came to us. But I realized that those dogs loved those kids and loved that family. I realized that they were barely being able to feed themselves, but they were somehow managing to feed 6 dogs. And I realized that I could no longer be a part of a program or a system that was systemically blocking people out, that was intentionally creating barriers to the service that we wanted people to take advantage of. And again, the ASPCA has changed dramatically since then, and all of those programs have changed and are no longer as, they're no longer pushing people out the way that they were. But at that time, I was lucky enough to meet the CEO of Emancipet, and we had this conversation that sort of stands out in my mind to this day, and that really defines all of the things that I do now and that we do at our organization, which was, we were talking about income qualification, which is, do you guys do means testing here, or income qualification for services? Some of you? So that, what to me was like the most normal thing in the world, because every single organization that I worked with did it. All of them did. And she asked me what I thought about it, and I said, you know, it's hard, but I don't really know any other way to make sure that the right people are using our services. And she said, yeah, I get that, but I just don't feel like poor people should have to prove it. Like, living in poverty sucks enough as it is. Being asked to prove that you're poor enough to deserve something that I want you to do doesn't make sense to me. And that was the best articulated argument that I'd ever heard. It was super simple, but for why we needed to stop creating barriers to people using our programs and having them prove that they were deserving of the services that we had to offer. And it really resonated with me because of those stories that I told you about, where essentially people were treated poorly or didn't get access to what they needed simply because they had never been messaged about spay and neuter, or they had never been messaged about vaccinating your puppies, and that they'd never had access to real veterinary care except for in an emergency situation. So I moved to Texas, land of cowboy hats, and we do the services that we do inside underserved communities. We open up our clinics inside communities that don't have veterinarians. We charge prices that are very low cost, and we have programs for free if people need it. We do outreach door to door. And I did outreach door to door when I was at the ASPCA, but I was always going door to door and telling people that if you can prove that you're poor, we will spay neuter your pet, which is something that you've never wanted to do, right? And that was always this hard thing, like how do you do effective outreach? People all had their tricks and tips. They would say, like, you have to tell them about that their dog's gonna get cancer if they don't. Tell them all the benefits, right? I'm like, does that not sound like I'm threatening their dog? Telling them that if they don't do this, their dog is probably gonna die. Tell them that their dog's personality will be better, that their dog all their bad behaviors will go away. Well, that's not actually true, so probably shouldn't tell them that. But that's the stuff that people would say. Everybody had their approach for doing this outreach. And so one of the things that I love about doing outreach now, I used to kind of dread it because it just felt like such an uphill battle. But now when we go door to door, we talk to people about their pets, we tell them what we have to offer, and we let them take advantage of whatever they want. And if that's a rabies vaccine, great. If that's spay-neuter surgery, great. If that's just coming in and having their animal examined because they're concerned about something, that's fine. Any interaction that we have with people is an opportunity to start to transform their behavior around their pet. And we can't expect them to transform it all at once. But more importantly, if we believe that people want to do the best that they can for their pets, if we believe that people are already doing the best that they can, and that the behaviors that we see that don't look the way that maybe we take care, how we take care of our own pets, if we believe that those behaviors are the result of being irresponsible versus just doing what they know, doing the best that they can, taking care of their animals to the standard of their community, taking care of their animals the way that their parents did, the way that they take care of their own kids, it opens the door to having a lot more productive conversations, to building inroads with people, and to reaching more people. So now I have this belief that I carry with me every time I go to talk to anybody about their pet, whether or not it's an animal that's in crisis because it's been injured because it wasn't on leash, or whether it's an animal that's sick because it hasn't been eating proper food, or because it wasn't vaccinated. If it's an animal that's running the neighborhood and doesn't have any ID on it, I talk to those owners with a belief in my heart that they love their pets and they want to do what's best for them, and that given the opportunity, they will. But it might take a few conversations. It might take a year. It might take 3 years. Most often it doesn't. Most often when you have this belief in your heart and you talk to people, they actually go along with what you would like them to do in a couple of conversations. Sometimes it takes longer, but really the key to it is understanding that you cannot build a path to success for someone if you don't believe that they can be successful. Does that make sense? You can't judge someone and serve them at the same time. And if we as a field are moving away from, well, not away from sheltering, but if we are growing our focus and widening our lens to be working with humans, we need to start looking more like human service organizations. We can't do this work because we hate people and we love animals. We have to love people to be effective advocates for the animals that we want to care for and that we want to save. Really wish my nose wasn't running so badly. And in order for us to build the programs that we haven't thought of yet, in order for us to innovate this field in ways that we haven't even dreamed of yet, we have to believe that the people that we want to serve, that the animals that are in the homes that need us the most, will go along with that change that we seek in the long run. And that we just haven't built a pathway for them to do so yet. And that's all I have. Thank you.